You're watching the A250 interviews, and I'm Louise Dubé, CEO at iCivics. The A250 interviews is a series of candid conversations about the intersection between democracy and education from a range of different perspectives. Today, joining us is Larry Kramer to talk about the power of the people in our constitutional order. Larry is a constitutional scholar, former dean of Stanford Law School, and is the president and vice chancellor of the London School of Economics. We hope you enjoy the conversation. Today, we're going to talk about judicial review, the Supreme Court, and the Constitution. Larry Kramer, president of the London School of Economics, formerly president of the Hewlett Foundation and iCivics board chair, has come back again one more time to be with us and to help us delve into these topics. Welcome, Larry.
Good to be back.
Larry published a book in 2005 called The People Themselves, Popular Constitutionalism and Judicial Review. So Larry, tell us just a little bit about the book, which to me seems more relevant today than ever.
So, I wrote the book at a time when it seemed like the court was really beginning to assert broad authority across a whole range of issues with kind of acquiescence on the part of everyone that was the way it was supposed to be. And whatever the court said, that was the end of the matter, and so be it. And I had been doing history for some time, and the book was really intended to recapture the original understanding, how judicial review emerged, what the original understanding of it was, and how recent that notion was in U.S. history, that it was really something that it had been a discourse, but really didn't take until the 1980s, actually. And so that there was a different way to think about the Constitution and the role that we all have as citizens in shaping how it's understood and enforced.
So let's go back then to this founding period and our history and where you started. Talk a little bit about why you think the founders had this understanding of judicial review as co-creators, not so much as final judicial supremacy.
The idea of a constitution isn't new in 1776. The Americans had lived within a constitutional system the whole time. There was a British customary constitution that was their constitution as well. The Declaration of Independence was an abrogation of that connection to that constitution. And so they wrote new constitutions, but understanding of how they worked was something that was, 200 years old at the time of the Revolution. And that understanding had enforcement of the Constitution in the community at large, not in courts. The American Revolution itself was a constitutional fight. The argument was that the British customary constitution did not permit Parliament to tax the colonies without representation in Parliament. And at no time did anyone on either side of the Atlantic suggest, it's a constitutional question, let's take it to court and have them tell us what the meaning of the Constitution is. That was just an unheard of concept. And so when they wrote the constitutions, and by the way, they wrote constitutions because having declared independence from England, they had abrogated various parts of the Constitution and they needed to rebuild them. And they didn't want to do it by custom over a long period of time. So they wrote a constitution to reestablish an executive branch, the branches of government and so on. But much of the British customary constitution remained valid in terms of how they understood it, and the text was situated within that broader tradition. The idea of judicial review begins to emerge at that point for the first time. And it emerges partly because you have written constitutions, and they make lots of details in the Constitution clearer than had been the case. Customary Constitution was pretty broad in its understandings. Partly, though, also because of their understanding about how government worked. So the idea was, in a monarchical system, the people had a role in enforcing their constitution against the government, which was the monarch. In the republican systems that are set up, the government is the people. And so what the government is agents of the people. So you've got agents of the people to do different things. So you've got a legislature to enact laws, and you've got an executive to enforce laws, and you've got a judiciary to interpret those laws. Okay. And now the question comes, the legislature enacts a law that some people think is against the Constitution. So there's two different views there at the time. One view says the people delegated the legislature as their agents to make laws. So no other branch has any business saying whether it's constitutional or not. If the people don't like the constitutionality of the law enacted by the legislature, that's for the legislature to decide and not for any of the other branches. That's the against judicial review argument. And it's kind of like, imagine I'm running a house and I have a gardener and a cook, and I have the cook cooking my meals and I have the gardener growing the vegetables, and the gardener keeps coming into the kitchen and telling the cook how to cook the meals. And be like, no, look, if I don't like the way the cook is cooking, I'll tell the cook, you just go out there and take care of the garden. That was the argument. Now, the argument on the other side is that's true. But when a case comes before the court and they are asked to enforce a law, they have to decide if the law is constitutional as part of their agency, because if the law is unconstitutional, then they shouldn't enforce it. It's ultra vires. It's outside the law, outside the legal authority. So they're not telling the legislature what to do. They're just doing their job as an agent of the people to do their part. And on that view, which is the early understanding of judicial review, none of the branches is superior to any of the others. They all do their best while doing their job. And if there are disputes or disagreements, it's up to the community to decide which branch has it right, which they would do through elections and protests and all the devices that Americans had traditionally used to express support or opposition to the government. So that's the original understanding of judicial review. There's no notion of the court as superior to the other branches. If anything, the hard argument was to say that they're equal to the other branches. And if you actually read Marbury versus Madison, that's actually what it says, that the court, in addition to or as well as the legislature, has to interpret the Constitution. And that's all it was for most of American history.
So let's just stick with this founding period for a second here. So just to give us a sort of more concrete sense of, if I were a judge during those first years, right, after the Declaration of Independence, what would I be? What would I conceive of my job, and what would be my interaction with all of the other institutions, social institutions that exist?
So, like I said, your job is to decide the cases that are brought before you. That's all. But if somebody says, okay, the plaintiff has brought this law, and I think that law is unconstitutional, and then the plaintiff you'd make the argument about why it was unconstitutional, the court would have had to decide that. So as I say, between 1776 and the early 1790s, on those rare occasions when courts say, yeah, you're right, that law is not constitutional, we're not going to enforce, hugely controversial, hugely. I mean, judges are impeached, there's huge pushback and also some support. And that said, it's not a big issue for the public. Most of the public is actually unaware of it altogether. If you look at the debates over the Constitution when it's enacted, there's like 36 volumes of material that's been collected. There's like 24 pages across the 36 volumes that actually talk about this. It's just not a big issue, because what Americans are assuming is the way the Constitution will be enforced is the way it was always enforced, which is the way it was enforced by them during the American Revolution, through protest and petitioning and, crowd action where necessary, and elections and popular enforcement. That's why it's called popular constitutionalism. The idea of legal constitutionalism is a kind of new idea, and it's subterranean. It only begins to get established in the 1790s, when there's more cases under the state and federal constitutions. And it gets established in the form that I suggested, where judges decide the cases in front of them. They think the law is unconstitutional. They don't enforce it. That kind of ends the matter, unless somebody wants to push back on that. But the pushback would be like, they're wrong, not, oh my gosh, the court said, therefore we're all stuck with it. Now it gets more complicated, because that idea that when the courts say it is final, that does begin to also emerge in the 1790s. So the conventional understanding growing out of the 1780s and into the 1790s is judicial review is the court's co-equal power with the other two branches. And if you don't like it, take it back to the public and let them decide. And we can talk about how that took place, which we should. But in the 1790s, after the French Revolution takes place, the conservatives in America get very worried about what that kind of rowdy democracy will mean. and they begin to develop arguments to tamp it down. And there's a lot of that. There's restrictions on free speech. There's all sorts of, but one of the arguments that's made is when it comes to the Constitution, courts should be final. We have taken the Constitution away from the people. And that's a very controversial position as well. And it becomes a major issue in the late 1790s when Congress passes the Alien and Sedition Acts during the French, the quasi-war with France. And the Republicans, led by Madison and Jefferson, say those laws are unconstitutional. And the Federalists, led by Hamilton and Adams, basically say the courts will tell us whether it is, so it's not your business. And that becomes a major issue. And of course, the Jeffersonians crush the Federalists in that election. And that is self-consciously understood as a repudiation of this idea of judicial supremacy. But it gets played out in the early years of the Jefferson administration in two cases, one of which is Marbury v. Madison, the other of which is a case called Stewart v. Laird. And in Marbury, what the court does, having ducked the issue in Stewart v. Laird, in Marbury, what the court does is it adopts the Jeffersonian view of judicial review, rejecting judicial supremacy, embracing judicial review, because there was, by then, an even more extreme wing on the Republican Party that wanted to reject even judicial review. So it's Marshall's way of getting one on the books in favor of at least this narrow notion of judicial review, but he did it only by retreating from the idea of judicial supremacy. And we know this because if you look at the language in Marbury v. Madison, there was a language that the Federalists were using to defend the idea of judicial supremacy. And there was a language that the Jeffersonians and Republicans were using to defend their narrower idea of judicial review. And Marbury uses all and only the language from the Jeffersonians and none of the language from the Federalists. So it was understood in context at the time as a rejection of judicial supremacy and an embrace of judicial review. And that becomes sort of the established position, although you get continued fighting all across the 19th and early 20th centuries.
So let me bring in a modern day civics teacher here who, almost everyone in all states, across all states, teach Marbury, the case. What would you tell a K-12 educator? How would you tell them to teach this case, given that you're talking to students who have only a limited interest in what happened hundreds of years ago and who are living in the world today that is quite polarized, particularly on this issue? So what would you tell them?
So I would start by saying you have to teach the history of it and give them that flavor and give them this sense that there is this idea of judicial review that does not include supremacy. Then you have to help them make sense of what that means today. And you do that in two ways. So one is to step back on the theoretical side and get them to understand that when you're trying to set up a Republican government, you're going to set up branches of the government and you have to balance two independent forces. One is your government needs to be accountable to the people. And two is it also needs to be sufficiently independent to act. Right? And so if you put the courts aside, if you look at the House of Representatives or the Senate or the presidency, they're all different balances of independence and accountability. So they're all subject to elections, but the elections are structured differently to give them different degrees of independence. In the House, it's very small districts, 2-year elections, so that makes them very accountable. In the Senate, as originally set up, it's every 6 years, so that gives them more independence, and it's indirect through the state legislatures. Now that changes later to become direct elections, but it's still 6 years, which gives you more independence. And then the president is a kind of mix of the two. It's a national constituency, but done through the Electoral College. And 4 years. So they're all different. And the idea is that very different mixes of independence and accountability will get us good outcomes. Because the different branches, they have different political interests, they'll fight it out. And where they settle is probably as good as we're going to get in terms of what the American people want. Now, the courts were made super independent, right? There's no electoral accountability. They have life tenure, and you can't touch their salaries because they weren't thinking about the courts having this role. They were thinking about the courts deciding individual cases, and they didn't want the political branches to be able to come in and say, I know he's innocent, I want him convicted, as is perhaps happening today. And so they made the judges very, very independent to protect that. But now suddenly, in the 1780s and 90s, this notion of a constitutional interpretation, which is policy, emerges. Okay, so now you have a problem that you didn't have, which is the judges are too independent to have that power. But how do you push back? If the other two branches support something you think is wrong, you can vote them out in the next election. If the courts do it, what are you supposed to do? And they had to solve that problem. Now, part three then is how do you solve that problem? If you look at modern constitutions in most of the rest of the world, particularly post-World War II in Europe, in Asia, everywhere, what they've done is they structured their judicial branches so that the judges would individually be very independent. So they would have the right to make the decisions and have review and couldn't be punished for it. But the branch itself was made accountable. Take most of the European countries, the judges serve limited terms that are staggered. The appointment is required by a supermajority of the legislature, so you have to have appeal on both sides. And their constitutions are made easier to amend. And the combination of those things means that although the judges are very independent, the court itself will never get too out of sync with where the rest of the country is, because there's constant turnover, because you can amend it if they got it wrong, because the appointments couldn't be extremists because they had to have appeals on both sides. So that's a really sensible way to balance independence and accountability for judges. Now, we didn't do that. Amending the Constitution is super difficult. But what happened in the United States case was instead other tools were found and used. So Congress has the power to set up the court. So if you didn't really like the way they were going, you could add judges. Or you could shrink the court, although you'd have to wait for the current judges to die or retire, but or you could fix their budget, or you could change their jurisdiction. All those powers are given to Congress explicitly in the Constitution, and they were used across American history when the courts seemed to be getting too out of whack with where the political branches were. And there's lots of instances in this. The successful ones were done by Jefferson and Jackson and Lincoln and FDR. And in all those and there were other cases where the pushback failed, because the court really does, if it's doing its job well, have a lot of credibility with the public. So political pushbacks don't always work. It takes a lot of support in a court that really is way out of whack with where the rest of the country is. But where that happens, those tools were used.
Yeah.
Okay, that's part three. One last part that I think is worth talking about with students is, when did that change? How did we get to where we are today, where actually everybody thinks the court has final say? And that actually begins with Brown v. the Board of Education.
Yeah. Let's hold off on that.
Okay.
Let's hold off on that. Let's go back a little bit. So if I were a teacher, and the way this is normally, Marbury is normally thought, I would have taught it as the famous case that established judicial review. I think the layer you're adding is a layer of social and political context and a balance over time between that and judicial supremacy. Am I right? Like, is that?
Yes. And the simple insight underlying it is the following. We say we're a Republican country, which means the people have ultimate control over the law. So it's rather bizarre to say the people have ultimate control over the law, except for the most important law, their Constitution. Like, that's completely crazy. And the founders would never have gone for that. It was exactly the opposite. They had to have control over the interpretation and creation of the most important law, which was the law made by the people to govern the governor. Yeah. And so what I'm saying is, you can have judicial review consistent with that. Judicial supremacy isn't consistent with that, which is why it was rejected.
So just to stay with Adams and Jefferson for a second, because I think another argument you're making is that history and civics are really not separate concepts. They should be taught together, as you've illustrated. And so do you also talk about sort of the political tension that is contained within the Alien and Sedition Acts between Adams and Jefferson, or is that what weight would you give to that?
Yeah, well, it's the context that helps you make sense of it, right? So of course you want to do that. I mean, constitutional law is always political. It's necessarily political. It's the law that sets the framework within which politics takes place and talks about who gets to do what. So it's unavoidably, not even unavoidably, it's necessarily definitionally political. So you have to think about the context.
So I actually was talking to somebody the other day and said, well, it appears that civics is getting politicized today And the comment struck me because I didn't understand how it could not be political, but you mean political in a different way than partisan. Can you explain that?
Yeah, well, I mean, partisan, yes, right. I mean, partisanship plays in because people choose the sides that they think are right or wrong. But you start with the assumption that people are making arguments in good faith about what they think the Constitution means. So, what you'd say is constitutional law. Here's the way I always talk about it: constitutional law is necessarily and always a form of customary law. It's just when you have a written text, the customs are refracted through the text as the way we understand and argue about and define the meaning of the text evolves over time. Even originalists are not going back to their understanding of what the original intent was is evolving over time, right? Justices Douglas and Black in the 50s and 60s were originalists. Just their originalism looks differently than the one today because it's just built into the process. You can't help but have the understandings evolve. But what we're always fighting about is the meaning of a text. But the understandings are evolving and changing as the conditions within which the questions are arising are evolving and changing.
And let's just take a look. Can you make the argument for judicial supremacy? You've basically said the judicial supremacy is inconsistent with republicanism, but it was made. What was the argument pro judicial supremacy?
Sure. So the argument that's made pro judicial supremacy looks essentially something like this. The Constitution is meant to be a more fixed and unchangeable law. And so the rowdiness of popular politics is a really dangerous place to have its meaning being determined on an ongoing basis. The court is constituted in a way that it can think, removed from politics more rationally and fixedly about what its meaning is. So we need to have deference to it. That's why they're made independent in the manner that they are. And if the people don't like it, they have to amend the Constitution. So there is an amendment process that was put in there that does give the people ultimate control, but through that device, which requires a much higher threshold of popular support to make the change.
And let's move now to the progressive era.
And you don't want me to tell you what's wrong with that argument?
All right, go ahead.
Well, just like the one thing first, there's something wrong with it historically, which is, again, if you know in context, the amendment process was put in there as an additional outlet. If you read the stuff, it was clear they actually always understood that the popular constitutionalism model of interpretation would always be running, but that if you had where the interpretation, it's still interpretation of the law. So if something needed to change a lot, then you would make new law. But making an interpretation were both within the community. The judicial supremacy version takes interpretation out of the community and leaves only making new law within the community. That's not consistent with the original understanding. And then you come back to this notion of it's also kind of crazy to think that people who fought a revolution to not have a monarch would then put what amounts to a monarch or an oligarch in charge of their most important law and its meaning and make it so difficult for themselves to make that change.
Just want to stay with this a little bit. The kind of system that you describe of judicial review and popular engagement and sort of the tensions around political activism and so on, it was a smaller community, obviously, at the time, and there were more institutions that represented self-governance. Would that be a fair statement? And how did those institutions work alongside judicial review at the time during that period before the progressive movement to make a self-governance actually work for the people?
Yeah, so it would be so the first thing I would say is it was smaller in numbers, but from their own perspective, way diverse. So divisions that we don't think are important were really important to them. So, people who'd come from different parts of Europe, those differences mattered. Religious differences within Christian sects, for instance, were hugely important and so on. So they were a very rowdy, community with lots and lots of differences. And, from their perspective, the national republic they created was on a scale that no one had ever seen before. So it was also seen as massively huge. So that's one. Two, they didn't have good political organizations to work this out. And that's why by 1798, they're on the verge of a civil war. And they had to develop political organizations that could manage democratic politics. And that turned out to be political parties. The political parties are created in the 1790s as a response to the felt need to have some way to organize people all across the country. So politics shifts from very personal, I'm voting for people I know in my community, but I don't trust anybody else, to policy focused, where I'm voting for someone who stands for these policies or that policies, and they're doing the same thing in other states. And then we organize the government within committees accordingly. So they're actually building those organizations all through American history to manage the politics.
See, you've made this argument that political parties are not in the Constitution, but they matter a great deal to our history, and they matter a great deal to our ability to govern ourselves. Make the case, because these days political parties are not all that favored. What is the pro argument for?
So first, one of the ironies of American history is that when politics seem bad, we blame the parties for it, and then we weaken them. And then politics get worse. And then we blame the parties some more, and we weaken them some more. So today we don't really have political parties, not in the form that they've existed. The argument for parties would go like this. Number one is an observation, which is no democracy anywhere in the world at any time has ever survived or managed without healthy political party systems. There's many different systems that you can have, but you need one. And when they break down, as ours has, and as is happening in many parts of the world, democratic politics falls apart. The reason is this: to make democratic politics work, you need simultaneously to manage three sets of, metaphorically call them negotiations. There's the negotiation between people within a community and their representatives. There's the negotiation between people with one community and people in other communities. And then there's the negotiation inside the government. And a political party is a structure that simultaneously manages those three negotiations. So we put up candidates who stand for positions in many different places. We provide the support for them to do so. And so the people in each community know what they're going to get when they vote for candidate A versus candidate B. They know what to expect from the government based on how candidate A's party did versus candidate B's party. And those parties will organize inside the government to deliver. If you don't have that structure, because, for instance, you've taken control over the resources that allow candidates to run for office away from the parties and given it to a lot of highly motivated, highly ideological individuals who use their resources to hold people in all different ways in all different places, or you make it so that the committee system doesn't work inside the government, or, you can think of the various ways in which the breakdown happened, but that's what you need parties for. And that's why you've never had successful democratic politics anywhere without them.
So in that context, the political parties need to be both functional and open primaries, like what is essential?
Again, there's a million different ways to run it. So there's not one right way. I mean, with parties also, you're balancing independence and accountability. The traditional party had a set of party bosses, professional party politicians who managed all this. That led to corruption. And that was the first, the progressive era was a dismantling of party corruption. They unfortunately threw out the baby with the bathwater in the way they did it. But, so you do have to balance how you structure your party system to ensure adequate openness and responsiveness, along with the ability to have control. And as I said, they did that reasonably well through much of the 19th century. We did it reasonably well in the middle 20th century. The periods where parties fall apart are the periods where our politics gets very chaotic. The Civil War was brought about. The Civil War happened when the Democratic Party split in 1856. And they split over slavery, but you lost the one national institution that could knit together the kind of compromises needed to keep things going. Right. And I'm not saying that was not a bad thing. Slavery was a bad thing. We needed to find some way to end it. But just from a political science perspective, it's worth noting that, as I say, you look at the unruliness of the progressive era, it's because they weakened parties so much. And then they got rebuilt in the Roosevelt era, and then we started weakening them again, in the 60s and 70s. And so on. And so you can see the patterns pretty clearly.
So if you were a civics teacher today, you would teach about the importance of the political parties as part of this entire system of governance. Is that right?
Yeah, but I try to get my students to step back a little and not think about all the bad stuff they hear about parties today and what parties are today, and get them to try and understand what we're talking about. What are the kinds of institutions that you need to have a functional democracy? So you do want separation of powers. You do want an independent judiciary. But you also want political parties that can serve the role of helping Americans accumulate their positions, because it can't happen just inside the government.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting for educators because a lot of students come in, particularly now, thinking that institutions are all bad. That we are, and that we were just about to talk about the progressive era where direct democracy systems are more in place. And I think there's an enormous amount of support for more direct democracy now. I'm not sure that people intuitively understand the role of like parties as institutions, but other institutions. So, how would you make that case, given the progressive era?
Well, as I say, I think you have to acknowledge for students today that the institutions that we're going to be talking about today are weak and broken and need to be fixed. And then the course is to teach them how, when they're properly constructed and functioning healthily, you can actually have a vibrant democratic politics that deals with issues, not immediately, right? But that over time really can do the right thing by its people. I mean, American Republic, we did bad things. There's no question about it. But we also progressively over time expanded the number of people who were included in our communities and dealt with many of the worst issues because of the healthy functioning institutions. And so for them, what they need to do is not become cynical and give it up, but go out and figure out how to rebuild those institutions in ways that will work in today's world. And it's hard. It's a big challenge today.
What
Yeah.
kind of such reforms do you think would achieve those goals? So, for example, expanding the size of Congress, that would be one? Open primaries is another. Ranked choice voting. What are these kinds
Yeah.
of
So
reforms?
I think ranked choice voting is a very healthy reform. What we need is what's undermined everything today is fragmentation in the community. So you need these parties to build consensus because you're going to have huge disagreements within a complex community, a big complex. There's going to be disagreements to make democratic politics work. Then you need institutions that can find accommodations across differences that are acceptable. If it's just two boxers sitting in the middle of the ring, each beating the heck out of each other, you're never going to go anywhere. They have to find a way to work together. So things that moderate the tendency of contemporary politics to pull out to the extremes. So ranked choice voting is a very good one. You need campaign finance reform, but a different kind of campaign finance reform than we have. So there are ways to do it, but the worst thing to do is turn it all over to wealthy individuals, which is what we've done. If you're not going to give control back to the parties, which is the way it worked for most of American history, then you need a really robust system of public support. And then you need to find other ways to strengthen some kind of restoration of parties, right? Professional organizations who understand their job as representing a broad coalition of Americans to achieve things that are in the interest of all Americans. I mean, what was interesting about the party bosses in their era, while they were corrupt in many ways, they also kind of managed a kind of temperate politics that got a lot of stuff done. And so what that institutional form looks like, I'm not sure. Um, our parties used to be broad coalitional parties. They've narrowed, right? So they're now like two little, if you take the continuum of where Americans are, instead of the parties being too big overlapping, they're like one over here and one over here. And so we need to think of ways to restore that sense of broad representation and building coalitions. Um, as I say, finance and ranked choice voting are two of those. Some of it is just building leadership that believes in that. The media and information problem is massive. That's the other one. We now have an information system that is by design pushes people out to the extremes and towards anger and so on. And if we're going to solve that problem consistent with our commitments to free speech, I don't know that I have an answer exactly to that. It's worth, though, struggling with, talking about it, trying to think about what you might do. I think there are things, you can certainly control social media, um, in ways that just have them structured in ways that make it more difficult for the extremist speech to be the speech that, wins the day without regulating it or forbidding it, right? So imagine a world in which, in the old days, if I wanted to get news, I had to subscribe to something or go to the newsstand. There was a little friction, and I wasn't interested in extremist speech. Most people aren't, so I would get what I wanted, and I just wouldn't get the other stuff. What social media does is it feeds it to you. I don't have to go for it. It just comes to me. It's like when I drive down the highway, if there's an accident, I know I shouldn't rubberneck, but I do. I can't help it. We all do. So social media are like they put in the accidents there along the way for you to see, and everybody's rubbernecking. So you could imagine a world in which you actually have to subscribe to the stuff you're going to get. The algorithms are changed so they don't feed you more and more extreme stuff. That wouldn't be an unconstitutional regulation. And just that little bit of friction would probably be enough. So people, we have to think about things like that in any event to make
Yeah.
this work.
Yeah. I mean, one question that I had was whether social media or any one of these, TikTok and so on, are now institutions in our system, and how would you
There's an argument to
evaluate?
treat them as public utilities and regulate them accordingly as we do public utilities. That's an argument. I don't know. I don't have a strong view on it one way or the other myself yet. The key to understanding, though, the problem isn't that the system isn't democratic enough. So making it more democratic isn't the solution, right? If anything, the framers understood direct democracy is a disaster. It never works. It's never worked anywhere in the world. It leads to mob rule always. So the idea that now we have technology and we can have direct democracy using technology is like, well, it's no better an idea with technology than it was without it. If anything, it's a worse idea. So the problem isn't that our democracy isn't direct enough. It's that the institutions that always mediate democracy are weak. We need to strengthen the mediation to make it work.
Huh, interesting. So how do you square that with the progressive era where, we did see a number of initiatives that were in favor, ballot initiatives, for example, recall elections, all of that? Like, is that a moment in time, or
Yeah,
how,
but no,
how
I
would
think
you?
most people look, my view, and I think most political scientists say, and all those reforms turned out to be bad. They're
Mm,
bad for the system. I mean, who thinks the initiative system produces good results anywhere? I lived in California for years. The ballot initiatives, almost all of the really bad things that happened in California politics happened through initiatives. So it was a logical response to real corruption in the party system. But as I say, they threw out the baby with the bathwater by instead of trying to fix that and make them more responsible and less corrupt, trying to go around them directly and because what happens, it's not that the people are stupid or wrong. It's who ends up controlling ballot initiatives and what people get and see. You've just shifted control to even more irresponsible, self-interested actors. So it's hard, the direct election of senators, fine. That was actually practically already the law by the progressive era. It had happened in the wake of the debates between Lincoln and Douglas. So that one, is probably a good reform. It's not like everything that they did was bad. Nonpartisan elections have worked reasonably well in many municipalities, but you wouldn't want to move that up to a larger scale. And that's because the job of a mayor is managerial. It's not really political. It's like, I got to make sure the garbage gets picked up. I got to make sure the snow is plowed. You want good managers. So that makes sense in that context, perhaps, but it wouldn't as you move away from management and more towards policy setting, and so on. So the progressive era was a moment in time. It produced changes that we've lived with. Some were good, some were bad. We've adapted to most of them, but it did accelerate the dissolution of parties. The next stage that dissolved parties even more was when their role as a welfare system got taken away and taken over by the government. And then TV and radio did the first whack at taking away their control over resources. Before TV and radio, if I wanted to run for office, I needed an army of volunteers. The party could turn out the army of volunteers. Once you have radio and TV, I don't need them to reach people. I just need money,
mm.
right? And then campaign finance reform and other reforms in the 70s in the wake of Watergate. So we've just been progressively weakening the structures that actually made politics work.
We've been talking about judicial review and its advantages, and then in the modern era, we get more and more bureaucratic, sort of this elitist system, this idea that judges are somehow special.
So, but here's what happens. As I framed it the first time, there was always a fight from the 1790s forward between the view of popular constitutionalism, which is there should be judicial review, but there had to be pushback. And the pushback in the US system took place through things like court packing and, jurisdiction shaping and budgets and so on, or the view that there needed to be judicial supremacy. And most of the time, the popular view prevails. Every once in a while, the judicial supremacy view emerges as it did around Jackson's time, as it did around Lincoln's time, as it did around FDR's time. And whenever that happens, and it becomes an issue where the American public wakes up and pays attention, the judicial supremacy position is crushed. Now, you could also look at those in political terms. It was always the progressive left that favored popular control. and the more uh, conservative right that favored judicial supremacy. And then comes Brown v. the Board of Education, which is the first time the Warren Court is the first court in American history that is both progressive and activist. And so the left flips and embraces judicial supremacy because they see it as a way to advance their agenda. And the right stays where it is. It doesn't flip on the idea of judicial supremacy. And the debate then shifts from the debate that had existed through American history over who has final say over the Constitution. Now everybody agrees it's the court, and it becomes a debate over how they should interpret the Constitution, because that wasn't really a big issue prior to the 1950s or 60s. And that's the debate we've been living with ever since. And conservatives settle on originalism, and progressives settle on various ideas of living constitutionalism. And that's the debate we have. Now, even so, that doesn't happen in a day. What I just described happens among the legal elite in the 1950s and 60s, but its seepage into popular political understandings is much slower. So Nixon running an anti-court campaign, in the late 60s, early 70s, and so on. And the event that really drives this home for Americans is the Bork hearings in 86. The issue on the table, the political issue that has everybody all upset, is Roe v. Wade, whether it's going to be overturned or not. But the way it's conveyed to Americans is this matters because this person you're going to put on the Supreme Court will decide what your rights are. And so the irony is Bork is defeated by a persuasion that we don't want someone who's going to tell us what our rights are, who will say no Roe v. Wade, but agreement across that they're going to tell us what our rights are. And since then, every single appointment is massively controversial because we've accepted now in the popular culture as well as in the elite legal culture that the court has final say over the meaning of the Constitution. But it's really something that doesn't really start until the 1950s to prevail, doesn't really establish itself until somewhat later, and is motivated by the flip on the left to align with the right on this idea of judicial supremacy.
That's fascinating. The Supreme Court is held in very low opinion recently. How do we get out of this? What is the way out?
So it's held in less, it's not the bottom. It's held in less high esteem than it traditionally was. And that's because of two things. One is it has in fact become more nakedly partisan and political. I mean, there's just no getting around the extreme predictability of all the justices' votes. And then they always say, no, we're united. We're 9-0 in all these cases. And it's like, yeah, those are the easy cases that don't matter, right? The Supreme Court decides, say, 75 cases a year. 65 of them are just legal issues that need to be settled. There aren't great stakes. In any case where there are important stakes, they divide on their politics. Made worse by the media system, which really plays that up. Made worse still by the way in which the political parties have turned the nomination process into something that is so nakedly partisan and political. So all of this, the messaging to the American people over and over again is this court is just political. And the court has done very little to try and undo that. So it would require them to try and actually, approach the cases and decide the cases and write opinions that actually conveyed something other than that. And they don't. They don't even try. I mean, the opinions, the dissents, the concurrences, they're always calling each other out for being like crazy, nakedly political and in extreme language and so on. So everything the court has done in the last few years contributes to this notion that they're nothing but one more branch of the political parties. And that's why you have to care who you appoint. And, Trump got his 3 appointments and now, oh my God, we're all doomed. And all of that way of thinking about it has been growing since the late 80s. It was always there, but much lower level, but really growing since the late 80s.
So in your view, if I had to guess, you would want to get back to a system that is much less in this kind of judicial awe of the Supreme Court and more a judicial review role, which restores power to.
I would put it a little differently. What I want to do would be a couple of things. One is I would want to change the nomination and approval process to one that was less loaded. So, these proposals to add a new justice every 2 years and have the 9 most junior ones decide cases, I think would be a brilliant way to ensure that the court reflected where the American public was now and that every appointment wasn't such high stakes because you weren't putting children on the court to extend your say for the next 4 decades. Everybody would be there for that period of time and there'd be a constant turnover. I think that would go far towards then creating space for the court then to approach its work in a much more even-handed way in which they were trying to actually persuade Americans of what they thought and trying to write opinions and work with each other in ways that actually reflected that. I would couple that, yes, with the sense that if the court does go off half-cocked, it is within our power and it is our responsibility to bring them to heal through the devices that have been used historically. But once you make clear that that can happen, you won't have to do it. That was the understanding across most of American history, and the court had tons of power and rendered decisions that were important and helped shape American constitutional law and politics in all sorts of ways because just it made them just sufficiently aware that they needed to appeal to decide cases in ways that worked within the American political system as it was. Instead, now, you'll see some of the justices, left and right, like they take pride if they do something that is completely at odds with where the American people are. Like that's kind of weird in a democracy.
So we need sadly to end very soon, and I think I want to put you in a classroom, and you have a bunch of teenagers in front of you, and they are pretty cynical about the exact set of circumstances that you've just described. How do you leave them with hope that our civic infrastructure can rise again?
So, to me, there are two things that you can do. So history matters and giving them a sense that history is so much more mixed, that of course there have been bad things, but also amazing things. And also recapturing the sense, of the American Constitution and the creation of the American Republic as a real miracle. I mean, there was 2,000 years of history of failures to do what we managed to do, and a huge political science and philosophy literature that it could not be done. And they did it. And with all the struggles and problems and stuff, it worked for so long. So that's one. And the other is to also give them that sense that they need to stop assuming that everybody else out there is not like them, right? I mean, they get hopeless because they think there are actually these evil people out there and there's nothing you can do about them, as opposed to like everybody's kind of like them and struggling hard on these issues and maybe reaching things that they don't agree with. But that's what conversation is about. That's what argument is about. And that's what getting involved is about. So you have a chance to improve and make it better. But if you just get cynical and back out, for sure it's going to go.
So that is a fantastic place to end, and urging to our community of educators to have more discussions that include more diverse sets of perspective, and to ensure that we have these hard conversations, because that's what's going to give us a road forward. I can't thank you enough, Larry, for being with us, and we'll do it again. Thank
All
you
right.
so
Thank you.
much.
Thanks. It's great to have this opportunity.
Fantastic.